Imagine, if you will, a world where the sky stretches endlessly in every direction, an immense dome of pale blue that seems to press downward with its own weight. Not the sky above your warm bed, but a sky that seems to hold the entire weight of the world beneath it, a firmament so vast that standing beneath it can make your heart quicken with something between awe and primal unease. The Mongolian steppe, vast and unforgiving, spreads across the landscape like a sleeping giant, golden grasses bending beneath a wind that has blown for centuries, touching nothing but earth and stone and the sparse wooden frames of nomadic tents, their felt coverings weathered to a dull grey by relentless sun and persistent frost. This is where our story begins, in the emptiness, in the silence that precedes something great, in a space so fundamentally different from the settled world of cities and walls that it seems to exist in a different category of human experience entirely. There is a vastness here that makes you feel small, insignificant, as if you could stand in one place and never be found, as if the landscape itself could simply absorb you into its indifference. The wind carries the scent of dried herbs, animal hide treated with smoke and fat, and the particular cold of a world unchanged by the markers of civilization, a cold that penetrates cloth and skin and seems to settle somewhere deep in the bone. The sun rises and sets with the regularity of a heartbeat, painting the grass gold and then crimson before surrendering to darkness complete enough to swallow the world. The people who call this place home have learned to move with the seasons as naturally as water flows downhill, following the graze patterns of their herds, moving to where water can be found when the spring thaws arrive and retreating to shelter when winter descends. They are the Mongols, though that word means little to them yet. They know themselves only through their tribe, through the bloodlines and grievances that connect them to some and alienate them from others. They are tribes, scattered and separate, each following the trails their animals carve through the grass, each living according to customs as old as memory and twice as stubborn. In this world before the Great Unification, there is no empire, no single vision, no overarching authority that speaks in the language of universal law. There is only survival and the endless conflicts that spring from it, conflicts as eternal and predictable as the seasons themselves. The Mongolian plateau is divided among dozens of tribal groups, the Tatars with their long history of warfare against all neighbours, the Kerit with their trade connections extending towards sedentary lands to the south, the Tartars scattered across the grasslands, the Kamug Mongols who control portions of the central plateau. They are not one people in any meaningful sense. They are divided by ancient grievances that have calcified into tradition, by claims to territory that have been disputed for generations until the original causes are buried beneath layers of counter-insult and revenge, by blood feuds that seem as natural and eternal as the wind itself, as inevitable as the turning of seasons. The tribes steal from one another with brazen regularity, raiding in small groups or massive operations, driving off herds of horses and sheep and cattle that represent not mere property but survival itself. They raid each other's camps for captives, women and children taken in acts of violence that serve multiple purposes at once, acquiring labour and breeding stock while simultaneously humiliating rivals. The women taken in these raids were integrated into their captors' families through marriage or concubinage, making kinship patterns complex and bloodlines deliberately tangled. They steal women and children in acts of violence that are simply how things are done, how life on the steppe operates according to a logic as old as the grasslands themselves. There is no central authority to say no, no regional power strong enough to enforce a broader peace. There is no law beyond the law of strength, no moral framework outside the framework of tribal loyalty. And the answer to that question, how does such chaos ever transform into unity, is far stranger and more human than you might imagine, emerging not from grand ideology but from the choices of a single exceptional individual. It begins, as so many great stories do, with an individual, not a king born to throne and crown, surrounded from birth by inherited legitimacy and the soft corruption that comes with unearned power. Not a general groomed for command through years of formal training in tactics and strategy, but a boy born into the uncertainty of tribal politics, a child born into loss and vulnerability and circumstances that would have destroyed most men, born into hunger that shaped his bones while young and his understanding while conscious. His name was Temüjin, and his life would change everything, would reshape an entire continent, would set in motion transformations that would echo for centuries across the vast distances of the world. Listen to this opening, to the way a legend is told around fires on the steppe, when the wind howls outside the felt walls of the ger and the family gathers close to the flames for both warmth and proximity to the stories that bind them together. They say that when Temüjin was born, around the year 1162, he came into the world holding blood in his tiny fist, born with his fingers clenched around a clot of blood, as though he had grabbed hold of something from the very moment of his emergence into this world. This is what the chronicles tell us, what the histories have preserved across the centuries, not merely that he was born, but that he arrived here as if already marked by conflict, already carrying the weight of struggle in his very cellular essence. His father was Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Kamag Mongols, a man of some standing but not great power, respected within his immediate circle, but unknown beyond the territories controlled by his tribe. Yesugei had just won a victory against a Tatar rival, had just defeated an enemy in battle after a campaign that tested his skills and the loyalty of his followers, and when his new son was born, he chose to name the boy Temüjin, meaning the most perfect steel or of iron, a name drawn from the Mongol language in a form that suggested both precious quality and resilience under pressure. It is a name chosen for strength, for resilience, for the quality of metal that can be hammered and heated and shaped and will not break, that can be folded back upon itself again and again and emerge only stronger for the process. But names, even those given with the weight of hope and pride, cannot protect you from the world. They cannot shield you from loss. They cannot prepare you for betrayal. The steppe teaches this lesson with cold efficiency, indifferent to hope, and unconcerned with human expectations. When Temüjin was still a child, perhaps 9 years old, his father took him to visit the family of a girl who might someday be his wife, a visit that served the pragmatic purposes of creating alliance between families, of binding one group to another through the promise of future generations and the mingling of bloodlines. This was not a matter of love, not in the romantic sense that might occur in settled societies with time for such luxuries, but of alliance, of binding families together through the promise of future generations, of creating ties that could be called upon when danger threatened or opportunity arose. The visit should have been simple, routine, the kind of expedition that young men undertook regularly as they moved into adulthood and their families began negotiating the arrangements that would define their futures. But on the journey home, with the girl's family now committed to the union, Yesugei was poisoned by members of the Tatar tribe, the very tribe he had defeated years before, their patience and sense of injury finally motivating them to action. Revenge, they may have called it, the settling of old scores that had festered since the earlier battle, the balancing of accounts according to a logic that transcended normal considerations of fairness or justice. But for Temüjin, watching his father die beneath the vast sky, it was the moment everything fractured, the moment when security shattered and vulnerability became his permanent condition. His father died in pain under the vast sky, and with that death came something worse than grief. Came a cascade of consequences that would reshape his childhood entirely, came vulnerability, came exposure. The family, suddenly without the protection of a strong man, was cast out by their own clan, as though weakness were contagious. The Mongols of Temüjin's line were abandoned in the steppes, left to fend for themselves among rivals who saw them not as relatives, but as weak and vulnerable prey, as competitors to be eliminated or exploited without the restraint that kinship might have imposed. Let yourself drift now into those years of hardship, into the cold reality of poverty on the steppe, into a childhood where comfort was unimaginable and survival was never assured. Temüjin's family, his mother Holun, whose intelligence and determination would prove crucial to her children's survival, his younger brother Kasar, who would become his closest ally, his sister Temülen, had nothing, or had been reduced to nothing through the combination of their father's death and the clan's rejection. The herds that were their wealth had been scattered by raiders or reclaimed by relatives who recognized no obligation to support the dead man's dependents. The protection that kinship provided had been withdrawn not through explicit statement, but through the simple refusal to share resources or extend the forms of aid that allowed survival in such an unforgiving environment. They lived at the mercy of the elements, hunting small game with crude weapons that they had to fashion themselves, gathering wild plants and nuts from the sparse vegetation that covered the steppe, moving restlessly in search of resources as seasons changed. The winters came with their crushing cold, arriving with the force of an invading army, turning the landscape into a realm of ice and wind that seemed designed to destroy the unprepared. The summers brought insects and heat that seemed to make the very air hostile to life, bringing swarms of biting flies that tormented both humans and animals, bringing an intensity of sun that could burn skin and dehydrate a person dangerously quickly if they were not careful. Temüjin grew lean and hard in these years, his body shaped by deprivation and constant exertion, learning not only to survive but to understand the calculations of power, the ways that strength and weakness created their own logical consequences. To see which tribes had resources and which had none, to recognize the patterns by which some accumulated advantage and others fell into poverty, to recognize that survival was never guaranteed, that it had to be taken or negotiated or earned through ability and will, but what happened next would change the direction of his life forever, would set him on a path that would lead ultimately to empire. As a young man, Temüjin began to make alliances with careful deliberation, moving with intelligence and patience through a landscape where one wrong step could prove fatal. The first and most powerful was with a Karaite chieftain named Togrul Khan, a man who had his own reasons for appreciating the young Mongol's talents, and recognizing in him qualities that suggested future usefulness and power. Togrul Khan was older, more established, yet he saw in Temüjin something worth cultivating, something worth taking under his protective wing. Their bond was sealed through the Mongol tradition of blood brotherhood, a ritual ceremony where they drank the blood of a sacrificed horse, mixed with mare's milk, a deeply sacred and binding act in steppe culture, promising loyalty unto death in a way that transcended ordinary contracts or agreements. Later, Temüjin formed another crucial friendship with a rival of his own tribe, a young man named Jamuka, who would become both his dearest friend and his intellectual equal, a confidant with whom he could discuss strategy and ambition. Jamuka would eventually become his bitterest enemy, their friendship splintering under the pressure of competing ambitions, their loyalty fracturing when the positions they occupied became mutually incompatible. These relationships were not based on sentiment but on something deeper, on the recognition of strength and capability, on the mutual understanding that these young men possessed something that set them apart from the ordinary run of tribal members, something that marked them for greater things. In Temüjin, others saw ambition guided by intelligence, the combination of wanting power and understanding how to accumulate and use it effectively. They saw someone who listened intently to the experiences of others, who learned from every encounter and observation, who understood the value of loyalty and would reward it generously with positions of power and access to resources, while punishing betrayal with merciless thoroughness. During these formative years, Temüjin also experienced capture and enslavement, the ultimate vulnerability, the descent into a condition where another person controlled every aspect of your existence. He was taken prisoner by the Tatars, people who had reason to remember him and his family, and placed in yoke alongside other captives, forced to do manual labour under the watchful eyes of guards, his young body subject to the demands of overseers who felt no connection to him and no restraint in their treatment. But even in this darkness, Temüjin's intelligence did not desert him. He watched everything, measured distances and guard patterns, observed the routines that governed the camp and the behaviour of his captors. He measured the distance to freedom with the precision of someone calculating a complex problem, understanding that escape required not just desire but knowledge and timing and luck working in concert. He waited for the moment when circumstances aligned, waited with the patience of someone who understood that premature action would be fatal. During a festival, when his captors were distracted with celebration, when their attention was divided and their discipline relaxed, he escaped into the darkness, running through the steppe without knowing if he would live or die, only knowing that he could not remain enslaved, that existence as a captive was a kind of death anyway. This pattern, capture, observation, escape, taught him something essential about human nature, about the relationships between power and vulnerability. It taught him that freedom is not passive. It is claimed. It is seized. It is fought for with the full force of your will and your intelligence in moments when the conditions permit action and you possess the courage to act. These early trials were not random cruelty, though they were cruel in their impact and effect. They were an education in the nature of power, dispensed by the steppe itself, lessons written in pain and loss and hardship that could not be forgotten or intellectually dismissed. By the late 1100s, the steppe was changing, though slowly, through gradual transformations that were not yet visible to those living through them. Various chieftains and young leaders were beginning to understand that the constant warfare and division was unsustainable, that the perpetual conflicts were draining resources without producing gains proportional to the cost. Some were experimenting with larger confederations, attempting to bind multiple tribes together under single leaders through a combination of negotiation, force, and marriage alliances. But none had Temüjin's vision. None had his unique combination of ruthlessness and diplomatic skill. None understood as clearly as he did what transformation was possible and how to achieve it. Throughout the 1180s and 1190s, Temüjin systematically built his power, building not haphazardly but according to a carefully developed strategy that he refined as he moved forward. He did this through 3 distinct methods, 3 approaches that together created a system unlike anything previously attempted on the steppe. First, he incorporated defeated enemies into his structure rather than destroying them, a revolutionary approach in a culture where tribal identity was paramount and outsiders were viewed with suspicion and contempt. He offered them positions, resources, respect if they pledged loyalty, understanding that people could be won over when they were treated with dignity, and given access to power and material advantage. This was revolutionary on the steppe, where tribal identity was everything, where absorbing outsiders was almost unthinkable, where the purity of bloodlines and the stability of traditional arrangements were considered paramount. Second, he created new structures of organization based not on blood relations but on personal loyalty and martial ability, breaking the traditional systems that had governed steppe society. He appointed capable men to positions of authority regardless of their tribal background, regardless of their birth or the prestige of their ancestors, creating a meritocratic system that rewarded effectiveness over heritage. Third, and most importantly, he broke the power of the great tribal chiefs who stood in his way, understanding that the old order could not coexist with the new. The Tatars were defeated, their power shattered through military action and political isolation. The Tartars were destroyed, eliminated as a distinct force through campaigns of remarkable brutality that were designed to make resistance seem futile. Rivals within his own tribe were brought to heel or eliminated, their bases of power dismantled or redirected. His friend and blood brother Jamuka, who had also begun gathering followers and developing his own ambitions, became an obstacle that could not be overcome through negotiation, a competitor whose removal was necessary for Temüjin's vision to be realized. In 1202, after a series of battles and political maneuvering that would have exhausted a lesser man, after campaigns that consumed years of effort and cost thousands of lives, Temüjin defeated Jamuka and absorbed his tribe, incorporating his followers into his growing confederation. The consolidation was nearly complete, the final pieces falling into place as Temüjin's power extended across the plateau. In 1206, a great gathering was held on the banks of the Onon River, a gathering called a Kurultai, a meeting of Mongol chieftains and leaders, a gathering that would become the defining moment of Temüjin's transformation from successful warlord to supreme ruler. Here, in this assembly beneath the open sky, the scattered tribes of Mongolia formally united under his authority, their independence surrendered in exchange for the benefits of unified command. Here, Temüjin was proclaimed supreme ruler, and he took a new name, a name that carried the weight of empire in its very syllables, a name that would echo across centuries and continents: Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The name itself is hypnotic, isn't it? The way it rolls across your tongue like distant thunder. The way it seems to contain within itself the sound of hooves and the cry of warriors and the breaking of old orders. The name of the man who had forged the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, an empire so vast that it would eventually stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. From this moment forward, the individual tribes ceased to exist as independent entities. Their autonomy surrendered to the greater whole. They became divisions of a greater whole, components of a unified structure designed to project power across unprecedented distances. The Kurultai of 1206 marks the beginning of the Mongol Empire, though its expansion was only beginning, though the greatest conquests still lay ahead. The foundation had been laid. The vision of one man had become the reality of a people, a shared project and commitment that would reshape the world. Now, let yourself sink deeper into the mechanics of what made the Mongol Empire different, what gave it the power to expand across continents and overcome all rivals. The secret was not weaponry, not advanced metallurgy or revolutionary design in the forging of blades and arrows. The Mongols did not possess advanced technology, did not have superior engineering or access to materials that were unavailable to their enemies. They had no siege engines of their own at first, no innovations in combat that were uniquely theirs, no technological advantage that could be attributed to superior knowledge or resources. The secret was organization, was the systematic arrangement of people and resources according to principles designed to maximize effectiveness. The secret was system, was the understanding that human activity could be directed and coordinated in ways that multiplied the impact of individual effort. Genghis Khan reorganized the Mongol military according to a principle called the decimal system, a mathematical approach to organization that broke large groups into manageable units bound together by clear chains of command. Every soldier belonged to a unit of 10 called an arban, 10 men who fought together and answered to a single commander. 10 arbans made a company of 100, called a jagun, under the command of a captain. 10 companies made a unit of 1,000, called a minghan, commanded by a senior officer. 10,000 made a 2-men, the largest unit, commanded by a general answerable directly to the Khan. This seems simple when stated plainly, almost obvious in its logic, but it was revolutionary in its impact and effects. For the first time on the steppe, you had a military machine that could be controlled, directed, coordinated with precision from the centre, whose movements could be directed by central authority, with a degree of coordination that had previously been impossible. Orders could flow down through predictable channels, moving from the Khan through generals and commanders and captains down to individual soldiers. Information could flow back up through the same channels, creating feedback loops that allowed commanders to understand the condition of their forces and adjust tactics accordingly. Units could divide and recombine according to need, could detach contingents for specific missions or purposes and reform as circumstances required. The entire army functioned like a single organism, able to move in concert across vast distances, able to coordinate movements that required perfect timing and understanding. Combined with this organization was the skill of the Mongol archer on horseback, a skill that represented a lifetime of training and experience built into the culture of the people. From childhood, every Mongol boy learned to ride, learning not merely to sit on a horse, but to move with the animal as a unified being, to move in concert with the horse's motion, and to give directions through subtle shifts of weight and pressure on the reins. To shoot, to develop accuracy through thousands of repetitions until the act became reflexive, until shooting became as natural as walking. To survive on the steppe, to endure hardship and privation, to navigate landscapes and find water and shelter and resources necessary for sustenance. By adulthood, these skills had been refined into something almost supernatural, capabilities that seemed to defy the ordinary human potential for learning and coordination. A Mongol archer could shoot with devastating accuracy at a full gallop, could aim and fire while moving at considerable speed without losing accuracy or power. They could fire up to 10 arrows in the time it took a foot archer to fire one, could sustain a rate of fire that quickly exhausted the ammunition supplies of conventional armies. They could turn in the saddle and shoot backward while riding away, creating the famous Mongol tactic of the feigned retreat, where archers would pretend to flee, turn, and unleash a withering volley on pursuing enemies. They could coordinate their fire with thousands of other archers, creating waves of arrows that would fall on enemies like a locust plague, creating casualties so extensive that they seemed almost incomprehensible. When Genghis Khan unified the Mongols, he had not only an organizational structure but a military composed entirely of people who had been raised in the saddle since childhood, who were comfortable with extended periods in the field on minimal rations, who understood tactical thinking and could adapt to changing circumstances. He had created an army that could cover 40 or 50 miles in a day, sustaining themselves on minimal supplies, appearing where enemies least expected them, striking with speed and coordination that conventional armies could not match. But there is more to military success than organizational structure in archery, more than superior logistics and the coordination of units. There is psychology, the way that fear operates in the human mind, the ways that expectations shape reality. There is the way you make enemies fear you before they ever face you in battle. How you convince opponents that resistance is futile before a single arrow has flown. The Mongols understood this deeply, understood the power of reputation and rumour, and the strategic dissemination of information about their capabilities. They would spread stories of their own brutality, deliberately cultivating a reputation for ferocity and destruction, allowing information to circulate about the fate of those who resisted. They would demand surrender and often accept it, offering terms that allowed conquered cities and regions to retain internal organization in exchange for tributary status and military cooperation. But only after demonstrating that resistance led to absolute destruction, only after making clear through concrete examples what happened to populations that chose to fight. Entire cities that resisted would be razed, their populations put to the sword, the buildings burned, the walls pulled down, everything destroyed in a fashion designed to be remembered and transmitted as warning to others. But cities that surrendered might be allowed to live, to submit to Mongol rule in exchange for tribute and obedience, their populations preserved as subjects who could contribute economically to the empire. This created a calculus in the minds of their enemies, a decision matrix that made surrender seem rational compared to the alternative. Fight and die. Surrender and live. Many chose surrender, choosing life under foreign rule as preferable to destruction. The Mongol armies grew not only through conquest, but through the incorporation of conquered soldiers into their own ranks, absorbing the military resources of defeated enemies. A man who had fought for a defeated prince could now fight for the Khan, and if he proved skilled and loyal, he would be rewarded with positions of power and access to resources, creating incentives that motivated capable soldiers to serve effectively. This was unprecedented in that era, completely different from the practices of established empires. It represented a kind of meritocracy that transcended tribal and ethnic boundaries, that selected for ability and loyalty rather than birth or heritage. Genghis Khan established something else that would prove crucial to the empire's success and longevity. The postal system, an innovation that would shape the flow of information across the vast territories under Mongol control. This was a network of relay stations spread across Mongol territory, staffed with fresh horses and supplies, positioned at intervals that allowed messengers to travel at remarkable speed without exhausting their animals. A message could be carried from one end of the empire to the other with remarkable speed, covering distances in weeks that would have required months through conventional travel. Military orders could be coordinated across vast distances, with the Khan directing operations in distant theatres from his court through the efficient transmission of commands and information. Information about resources, enemy movements, and opportunities could be transmitted in days rather than weeks, allowing the central authority to respond to developments with a speed that gave the Mongols substantial advantages over more cumbersome rivals. The system was so effective that it would outlast the empire itself, influencing the design of postal systems in many subsequent societies and becoming a model that others would attempt to replicate. These innovations, the decimal organization, the psychological warfare, the integration of conquered peoples, the communication network, made the Mongol Empire qualitatively different from any empire that had come before, not merely an expansion of existing patterns, but a fundamental reimagining of how power could be organized and projected. It was not merely larger than its predecessors, was not simply a bigger version of existing empires. It was fundamentally more efficient, more flexible, more capable of projecting power across incomprehensible distances, more responsive to circumstances as they evolved. And the answer to how this could be achieved by a people without great cities or advanced civilization is perhaps the most profound insight of all, the deepest truth about what the Mongols accomplished. The Mongols succeeded because they embraced what they were, because they did not attempt to become something other than what history and environment had made them. They did not try to become settled peoples, did not aspire to build elaborate cities and fixed settlements after the fashion of sedentary civilizations. They did not build elaborate bureaucracies modelled on sedentary states, did not attempt to adopt the administrative structures and organizational patterns of the societies they conquered. Instead, they took the skills and adaptability that nomadic life had given them and weaponized them, turned them into instruments of power and control. They took their superior horsemanship and their ability to sustain life on minimal resources and turned them into military advantages, made them the foundation of a system that could project power across continental distances. They were not warriors trying to learn civilization, were not the sons of nomadic mothers attempting to become sedentary like the peoples they conquered. They were nomads who had simply learned to organize their conquest and use it to benefit themselves and those who served them faithfully, who had discovered that organization and discipline could multiply the impact of the skills they already possessed. By 1209, Genghis Khan was ready to look beyond the Mongolian plateau, ready to extend his reach and test his system against opponents on a larger stage. He had consolidated his power across Mongolia, had created his military machine and tested it against rivals, had established the structures of governance that would sustain his empire through expansion and growth. To the south and east lay tempting targets, regions of wealth and developed civilization that promised resources to fuel further expansion. The Tangut kingdom of Xixia, a Buddhist state that controlled important trade routes along the Silk Road, became one of his first major objectives, a prize that offered both wealth and strategic position. Xixia had grown wealthy and complacent from centuries of trade, their population accustomed to prosperity and security under stable governance. Their army, trained in the methods of sedentary warfare, had no experience with the tactics and speed of the Mongols, could not effectively counter the mobility and coordination of horsemen operating at distances far beyond the range of conventional warfare. When Genghis Khan's armies appeared on their borders, it was as if the wind itself had become an enemy, as if the natural forces of the steppe had taken physical form and moved against them. The Mongols did not attempt the kind of elaborate siege warfare that the Xixia might have expected, did not employ the sophisticated engineering that sedentary states had developed for this purpose. Instead, they surrounded cities, cut off supplies, offered surrender under terms that varied based on the willingness of the city to submit. Many cities fell after brief resistance, their defenders realizing that prolonged defense was futile against an enemy that could simply wait. Others held out longer, only to see their populations slaughtered when they refused to yield, when they continued resistance past the point where surrender remained an option. By 1209, Xixia was essentially a Mongol vassal state, required to provide tribute and military support to the Khan. Its independence surrendered in exchange for preservation of its core population and basic governance structures. The conquest of Xixia was significant not merely for the territory and wealth it brought under Mongol control, not merely for the resources that could be extracted through tribute and taxation. It gave the Mongols control of the trade routes, of the flow of goods and information across Central Asia, placed them in a position to profit from the commerce that connected east and west, north and south. The success against Xixia encouraged Genghis Khan to look even more boldly to the north and west, toward targets of greater magnitude and consequence. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China, a settled civilization with vast resources, advanced technology, and a population that numbered in the millions, making it one of the wealthiest and most advanced states of the era. The Jin had once dominated the region, had established themselves as the paramount power through military success and political acumen, but they had grown soft and fragmented, suspicious of their own generals and divided in their strategic vision. They saw the threat posed by the unified Mongol state, but they were unprepared for the speed and coordination of Mongol warfare, could not match the mobility of enemies who did not depend on supply lines and fortifications. The first major clash came in 1205, when Mongol forces defeated Jin armies near the Great Wall, battles that were fought along the frontier between the steppe and settled civilization. These were not small skirmishes, engagements of a few hundred warriors settling local disputes. These were battles that involved thousands of soldiers, that demonstrated that the military innovations of the Mongols were effective not just against nomadic rivals, but against the established power of an ancient empire with centuries of military tradition. The Jin dynasty found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, an enemy that could not be negotiated with through the traditional mechanisms of statecraft, an enemy that appeared where expected least and moved with bewildering speed, an opponent whose capabilities seemed almost supernatural in their effectiveness. But what happened next in these wars against the Jin dynasty would demonstrate something even more profound about Genghis Khan's genius, his ability to adapt his tactics to new circumstances, to learn from each engagement, and to gradually overcome even the advantages that settled states possessed, advantages derived from wealth, population, and established military traditions. The wars against the Jin would stretch across decades, consuming enormous resources and causing immense suffering across the landscape of northern China as the Mongols gradually moved south and consolidated control. Yet they would also eventually establish the Mongol Empire as the dominant power in all of Asia, a transformation that would reshape the entire political and cultural map of the known world, creating a new order where Mongol rule was supreme. For now, in these early years of conquest, we are witnessing only the beginning of that process, the initial momentum that would drive the Mongols to the very edges of the world, toward horizons that seemed infinitely distant. As you listen to this account, let your mind sink deeper into the vastness of the steppe, into the long nights under stars so numerous they seem almost solid, pressing down from above with their weight and presence. Think of the vastness that surrounded Genghis Khan as he gazed from his tent toward horizons that seemed unlimited, seeming to stretch to the edges of creation itself. Think of the wind, carrying sounds from distances impossible to measure, sounds of horses with their rhythmic hoofbeats, of moving armies with their coordinated motion, of empires shifting and transforming in the darkness as old orders gave way to new. The story we have shared is one of transformation, of how a single vision and extraordinary intelligence and ruthless ambition combined to reshape the world. But more than that, it is a story about human adaptation, about how people respond to challenge and hardship. Temüjin was born into loss, into poverty, into a world that seemed designed to crush him, that offered him no advantages and many obstacles. Yet through intelligence, through strategic thinking, through the ability to inspire loyalty in others, he created something entirely new, something that had not existed before. If you're watching the Calm Archive, you already know that we are devoted to telling stories like this, stories of transformation, of ambition pursued across the landscape of history, of individuals who changed the shape of civilization through force of will and vision. Let your body relax further into your bed, feeling the support of the mattress beneath you as your muscles release their tensions. Feel the weight of your head against your pillow, the softness of your blankets around you, the cocoon of comfort that surrounds you in this moment. The steppe that surrounded Genghis Khan is thousands of miles away and centuries in the past, but its story lives on in the structure of the world you inhabit today, embedded in the patterns that govern modern existence, the roads that carry commerce across Asia, the postal systems that connect distant places, the organizational principles used by institutions of power throughout the modern world. All of these trace their lineage back to a unified vision created in the emptiness of the Mongolian plateau. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the vastness, imagine the endless grasslands extending in all directions beneath a sky that seems to contain the entire universe. Imagine the wind carrying voices from the past, carrying the names of warriors long dead, carrying the echoes of commands that moved empires. Imagine the slow, inevitable transformation of isolated tribes into an empire that would reshape history. The story continues, the empires grow, the world changes, configurations shift and new powers emerge. But for now, let that be enough. Let the image of the steppe at night settle into your mind, a landscape bathed in starlight and wind. Let the silence be complete, undisturbed by the noise of the modern world, and as you sink deeper and deeper into sleep, know that you are carrying with you the story of Genghis Khan, the story of unification, the story of a vision so powerful that it transformed everything it touched. Imagine, if you will, a moment of profound miscalculation, a decision made in chambers far from the steppes that would ripple outward through centuries like stone cast into still water. Picture yourself in a grand palace somewhere between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, in the year 1218, a time when empires still seemed eternal, when the very notion of decline was unthinkable to those who had inherited power. You are the Shah of Khwarezmia, Muhammad II, a man of considerable power and considerable pride, ruler of one of the wealthiest and most strategically positioned empires in the known world. Your kingdom stretches across what we now call Central Asia, the crossroads of the known world, the place where the Silk Road threads through mountain passes and across desert plains, like veins of precious metal through stone. Your merchants trade in silks so fine they seem almost weightless in the hand, in spices whose aromas can transport the mind across vast distances, in precious stones that catch the light and transform it into something otherworldly. Your cities rise with minarets that touch the clouds, their surfaces covered in tilework of such complexity and beauty that one could spend a lifetime studying the patterns and still discover new meanings within them. You are accustomed to deference, to the bowing of lesser princes, to the careful formality with which envoys from distant lands approach your throne. You are the master of your world, or so you believe, and then something arrives at your gates that will change everything, that will set in motion a cascade of events that will alter the very shape of human history. Genghis Khan, still known to much of the world simply as Temüjin, has sent envoys. Just envoys. Not an army. Not yet. He wishes to establish trade relations with your empire, to open the channels of commerce so that goods and wealth might flow more freely between your realms. It seems almost quaint, doesn't it? The thought of a man from the distant steppes, a man whose name most people in your palace cannot even pronounce correctly, sending emissaries as if he were a peer, as if his authority had been established through centuries of accumulated legitimacy. Most of these envoys are executed. Their heads are sent back across the mountains, a message written in the ultimate language of rejection. One messenger, a man of particular importance, is also put to death, his dignity stripped away in his final moments. This is not cruelty in the way you might imagine it, not the spontaneous violence of a tyrant overcome with rage. This is protocol, custom, the assertion of dominance through the application of forms that have been observed for generations. You are telling Temüjin that you do not recognize his authority to reach out to you as an equal, that his claim to standing among the great powers of the world is premature, perhaps even absurd. But what happened next would change the world forever, and not in the way the Shah could have imagined. The consequences of that decision would echo through the centuries, reshaping continents and redefining what was possible in the art of conquest and empire. Genghis Khan receives news of this insult in his encampment on the steppes, somewhere in that vast expanse of grassland where horizons stretch so far that they seem to blur with the sky itself. Listen to the silence that must have followed when the news was delivered, the kind of silence that falls when something irreversible has occurred. This was not simply a rejection of trade, not merely a refusal to engage in commerce. This was a direct challenge to his honour, to his authority as a rising power, to the very legitimacy of his claim to be treated as an equal among rulers. In the world of the steppes, where the landscape itself seems to demand a certain kind of clarity about power and dominance, where honour meant everything, where a man's word and reputation were the only things that truly mattered in the great emptiness of the grasslands, where the wind carried stories and warnings across hundreds of miles, this insult could not stand. It could not be overlooked or forgiven. It demanded a response that would be proportional to the offence, that would demonstrate conclusively that such a challenge could not go unanswered. The response would be, in the truest sense of the word, legendary. Between 1219 and 1221, Genghis Khan mobilized what some historians estimate to be around 200,000 warriors, though the true number remains lost to time, obscured by the mists of history and the exaggerations of chroniclers who could barely comprehend what they were witnessing, who struggled to find words adequate to the scale of what they were trying to describe. Imagine the sound of this army on the move, a sound so vast and overwhelming that it would have been audible from many miles away. Not the organized columns of European knights, marching in formation with the precision of creatures trained for centuries in the art of organized warfare, and not the structured formations of Chinese emperors' armies with their rigid hierarchies and predetermined movements. This was something far more devastating in its fluidity, in its adaptability, in its ability to shift and reform like water finding its way through a landscape. Horses stretched across the plains as far as the eye could see, their hooves creating a sound like rolling thunder that never quite fades, only recedes and returns, growing closer again as more columns approach. The smell of horse sweat and leather, of earth churned to dust by countless hooves, of smoke from countless cooking fires scattered across the grasslands, of the distinctive scent of a vast army on the move, something acrid and almost overwhelming to senses accustomed to the cleaner air of the steppes. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezmia was not merely a military conquest, not simply the victory of one army over another in some tactical engagement that would be forgotten within a generation. It was the systematic application of terror as a strategic tool, perfected through years of nomadic warfare on the steppes, refined through generations of conflict with rival khans and hostile tribes. The army divided into columns, and each column had a specific purpose, a role assigned by a command structure that was far more sophisticated than outside observers realized. Some columns were meant to destroy, to demonstrate the cost of resistance with a clarity that could not be misunderstood. Others were meant to surround, to cut off escape, to ensure that no sanctuary existed for those who chose to fight back, no refuge that the Mongol reach could not extend into. Speed was their greatest weapon, more valuable than armour or fortifications or traditional military advantages. The Mongol cavalry could cover distances that seemed impossible To sedentary peoples accustomed to the pace of peasant armies and merchant caravans, they could pivot and reorganize in minutes, wheels turning where European forces would require hours of careful maneuvering. They operated in a way that defied the expectations of classical military theory, that seemed almost magical to observers who had only known more ponderous forms of warfare. The great city of Bukhara fell first, though fell is perhaps too gentle a word for what occurred, a word that understates the complete transformation that took place. The city walls, which had stood for centuries, which had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, which had protected merchants and scholars and ordinary people going about their daily lives, were breached in a matter of days. The population is said to have exceeded 300,000 souls, people engaged in their ordinary pursuits, entirely unprepared for what was coming toward them across the plains. Most of them would not survive the siege, would not live to tell stories of the conquest to future generations. Mongol historians, writing years later in a curious attempt to record their deeds with accuracy, would describe the conquest with a kind of detached precision that somehow makes it more chilling than any emotional account could be, more disturbing precisely because of its refusal to acknowledge the human dimension of what had occurred. The survivors, those who were not killed in the initial breach, who had somehow avoided the sweep of Mongol swords and arrows, faced a choice that was no choice at all: enslavement or death. Some chose to flee, to attempt escape into the territories beyond, hoping against hope that somewhere there might be refuge. The steppes around Bukhara became filled with refugees, wandering without direction, searching for some place that the Mongols had not yet reached, some sanctuary that might still exist beyond the reach of conquest. There was no such place. The city itself was systematically dismantled with a methodical intensity that suggests planning and purpose beyond mere destruction. Buildings were burned, their roofs and wooden beams consumed by flames that must have turned the sky itself orange and red. Libraries containing thousands of manuscripts accumulated over centuries went up in flame, the collected knowledge of generations reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The great mosques, which for generations had called the faithful to prayer with voices that echoed across the city at dawn and dusk, fell silent, not just ruined and broken, but emptied of their sacred purpose, stripped of their meaning. The presence of what had been is more haunting than its complete absence, the memory of greatness making the ruin all the more profound. Feel the weight of that destruction, the heaviness of an entire civilization being unmade in front of your eyes, the sense of something precious and irreplaceable slipping away into the past. This was not the work of a single day of fury, not a brief outbreak of violence that could be quickly concluded. It took weeks of systematic effort, column after column of soldiers moving through the streets, ensuring that nothing of value remained that could not be carried away or destroyed, that nothing stood that might be remembered as a symbol of former greatness. The smell of smoke and ash must have hung over the city like a pall, a kind of funeral shroud for a place that would never be the same, that had entered into a different mode of existence entirely. The residents who survived must have wandered through those burnt-out streets in a kind of daze, unable to comprehend the transformation that had occurred. From Bukhara, the Mongol armies moved onward with relentless determination, and their next target was Samarkand, often called the Jewel of Central Asia, a designation that was earned through centuries of accumulated beauty and wealth. Samarkand was perhaps even more magnificent than Bukhara, more developed, more culturally sophisticated, more confident in its own importance in the world. Its bazaars were legendary among traders from every corner of the known world, places where you could find goods and materials that did not exist anywhere else, where merchants from China and Persia and Europe gathered to exchange not just commodities, but stories and technologies and ideas. Its architecture was extraordinary, a synthesis of Persian, Islamic and Turkic influences that created something utterly unique, something that could not be replicated because it emerged from a specific moment in time when these traditions intersected. The city's walls were formidable, designed with the accumulated knowledge of generations of siege engineers, its garrison sizable and presumably confident. And yet the Mongols had learned their methods well, had studied the techniques of siege warfare as they encountered them, and incorporated them into their own practice. They did not assault the walls directly in the manner of previous invaders, did not expend their strength in a frontal assault against prepared positions. Instead, they waited with a patience that seemed almost unnatural, that seemed to defy the temperament of nomadic warriors usually eager for action. They cut off supplies, choking the city with careful precision, making hunger into a weapon. They demonstrated their numbers, their evident superiority in every dimension of military capability, arranged their forces in such a way that the city's defenders could contemplate their own doom. They offered terms of surrender, creating a moment of choice that was meant to seem merciful in comparison to the alternative, and when the garrison did fight back, when they attempted a sortie against the Mongol camps, when they tried to break the siege through one final desperate assault, they were annihilated in a display of military superiority so overwhelming that it left no room for hope of further resistance. The city surrendered. The population was herded into the open plain outside the city walls, gathered together where they could be observed, controlled, and directed according to the conqueror's will. Soldiers moved through Samarkand carrying off anything of value, anything that could be transported and incorporated into the wealth of the conqueror. Workshops were dismantled, artisans were killed or enslaved, their skills and knowledge now serving new masters. The libraries were burned, their contents consigned to ash. By the time the Mongols were done, Samarkand had been reduced to a shadow of itself, a place of ruins and echoing silences where once there had been the sound of commerce and laughter and human activity. And the answer to that question, what had driven the Shah himself to flee, what had broken his will to resist, was driven home by the simple fact of the conquest advancing across his empire like a tide that could not be stopped. Muhammad II, the man whose pride and anger had set all of this in motion, did not stay to defend his empire, did not attempt to make a last stand in some defensible position. When he realized the scope and speed of the Mongol advance, when he understood that he could not defeat them through conventional means, when the reality of what was happening finally penetrated through his layers of denial and disbelief, he fled. He ran from his own capital, from the great cities he had ruled, from the empire he had inherited and believed himself to be invincible within. He ran eastward, always eastward, pursued by Mongol riders who seemed to materialize at every turn, who gave him no opportunity to gather resistance or organize a defense. He made his way toward the Caspian Sea, moving through landscapes that had once been entirely under his control, now transformed into places of danger and pursuit. And then he simply stopped, his strength or his will finally exhausted. He appears in historical records one final time on a small island in the Caspian, broken, defeated, a shadow of the proud ruler he had once been, his authority stripped away, his empire dissolved into fragments around him, and then the records become silent. It is believed that he died there, though no one knew exactly when or how, what final illness or despair claimed him. In a way, his death was almost merciful. He did not have to witness the complete destruction of everything he had built, the systematic dismantling of his civilization, but the pursuit itself, the great cavalry chase that followed Muhammad II's flight, has become one of the most legendary military accomplishments in history, a feat so remarkable that it seems almost to cross the border between history and mythology. Two of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Jibi and Subutai, warriors of enormous skill and creativity, took 20,000 mounted warriors, and they did something that seemed almost impossible to contemplate. They rode after the Shah, not just pursuing him to his death, but continuing onward, outward, expanding the conquest into territories that had barely heard the name Mongol. They rode around the Caspian Sea, their horses' hooves drumming across landscapes that had never known the Mongol tongue before, that had only known the speech of different peoples, different cultures, different political powers. They rode through the Caucasus Mountains, their breath misting in the thin, cold air at high altitudes, the temperature dropping so severely that men accustomed to the steppes began to question whether they would ever feel warmth again. They rode into the lands of the southern Russians, into places that had never dreamed of Mongol conquest, that had existed in a world that seemed entirely separate from the great empires of Asia. The distance they covered, according to historians who attempted to reconstruct their path, was nearly 20,000 miles. Let that sink in for a moment. 20,000 miles on horseback. In a campaign that lasted years, a journey so vast that it required passing through multiple climates and terrain types, facing obstacles of every conceivable kind. The logistics alone seem impossible. The supply lines extended far beyond what seems credible. The endurance required surpassing anything that historical armies are generally believed to have achieved. And yet, it happened. These warriors rode through mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold, across open plains where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, across deserts where water became more precious than gold, through valleys and gorges and regions they had never encountered before, always moving, always searching, always pushing the boundaries of what conquest could mean. This was not a mere military expedition, not simply a campaign designed to accomplish specific tactical objectives and then return home. This was a demonstration of capability that was meant to terrify, to show that the Mongol reach was essentially unlimited, that no distance was too great, no obstacle too formidable, no territory too remote to escape the expansion of Mongol power. And it worked. When the news of this campaign reached the courts of Europe, when it filtered through to the knowledge of rulers and generals and strategists, something shifted in the consciousness of the known world. The idea that an army could be so mobile, so far-reaching, so utterly devastating in its capabilities, challenged everything that military thinkers had previously believed to be true. The very foundations of military theory seemed to require revision. Now, picture yourself in one of those cities, not at the moment of conquest when the smoke still rises and the sounds of violence still echo through the streets, but in the days and weeks that followed, when the armies had moved on to other objectives. The silence is profound, deeper than any silence you have known before, the silence of absence where once there was activity. The great centres of learning and culture have been destroyed or severely diminished, their accumulated knowledge dispersed or lost. The trade routes that connected the world, that had brought prosperity and possibility, are suddenly controlled by a new power, reorganised according to a new set of principles and purposes. But here is the thing that the sources do not always emphasise clearly. Once the Mongols had established their control, once the immediate violence had ceased and some kind of order had begun to emerge from the chaos, something began to change in the character of conquest itself. The fear did not go away. In fact, it shaped everything that followed, infected every decision, coloured every interaction between the conquered and the conquerors. But the fear was now harnessed toward a new purpose, channeled into service of the new regime. The Mongols had not conquered merely for the sake of destruction, though destruction had certainly been necessary to establish their authority, to make clear that resistance would be futile. They had conquered because they wanted to rule, to control, to create something unprecedented in human history. The siege tactics that the Mongols employed during this campaign were astonishingly sophisticated for an army that came from the steppes, a place where siege warfare was largely unknown, where conflict had traditionally taken the form of cavalry charges and raids, rather than systematic reduction of fortified cities. They had learned these techniques from the Chinese, from the peoples they had encountered and conquered in their years of expansion, studying the methods that had been refined over centuries of conflict between states. They brought with them catapults, siege engines that could hurl massive stones against city walls with tremendous force, engines that required precise engineering to construct and operate effectively. They brought engineers who understood how to build these engines, how to maintain them in working order as they were transported across vast distances, how to deploy them with maximum effectiveness against the specific weaknesses of each city's defences. But the Mongols did not stop at conventional siege warfare. They diverted rivers when they could, cutting off water supplies to besieged cities, applying knowledge of hydraulics and geography to achieve their military objectives. When direct assaults seemed too costly, when the expenditure of lives might be greater than the value of the objective, they used terror as a weapon. They built massive pyramids of skulls outside city walls, monuments to the fate of those who had chosen to resist. They sent back the heads of executed governors to preceding cities as messages, creating a kind of communication based on the ultimate vocabulary of fear. This was psychological warfare in perhaps its purest form. By the time a city faced the choice between surrender and siege, many of them had already heard stories of what had befallen their neighbours, tales that grew in the telling, accounts that transformed military events into almost supernatural horrors. The choice often seemed like an easy one by comparison. Surrender, and your people might be enslaved, but they would live, would continue to exist in some form. Resist, and everyone would die, would be wiped from the earth as if they had never existed. It was a calculus that left little room for heroism, that made virtue into something that could cost you everything. Some accounts, written centuries later by chroniclers who were perhaps describing things they had heard about but not witnessed directly, speak of biological warfare, of plague-infected corpses being catapulted into besieged cities, of a deliberate strategy to spread disease as a weapon of conquest. Whether this actually happened is debated among historians, but the fact that such stories were told, the fact that contemporaries believed the Mongols capable of such tactics, speaks volumes about the reputation they had earned, about the sense that they would stop at nothing to achieve their objectives. Fear became a tool as effective as any siege engine, and the Mongols understood how to deploy it with precision and creativity. But what happened next would transform everything that had been destroyed into something new, something that had never existed before in quite the same way. And here we must pause, for we have reached a moment of profound significance in the history of the world, a moment that divides the past into two distinct periods, before and after. If you are following along on this journey of understanding, we encourage you to pause here and reflect, or to return to these events later in the Calm Archive, where you can explore these histories in deeper detail, where the full context and implications can be examined at your own pace. The Mongol conquests had created something that had never existed before in quite the same way. They had created a unified space of authority that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe, a territory so vast that the human mind struggles to contain the idea of it. And within that space, something remarkable began to happen, something that would reshape human civilization. The Silk Road, which had always been a network of trade routes connecting distant markets and peoples, became something far more than that. It became, in effect, the largest free trade zone that the world had ever known, a space where commerce could flow almost uninhibited by the barriers that had previously divided the world into separate spheres. Merchants could move goods across vast distances with a confidence they had never experienced before, secure in the knowledge that bandits would be suppressed and routes would be maintained. The Mongol state, for all its violence, for all the ways it had demonstrated its willingness to use overwhelming force against those who resisted, was remarkably stable once established. Banditry was effectively suppressed through swift and terrible punishments. The roads were patrolled by soldiers who ensured that merchants could travel in relative safety. A merchant travelling from China to Persia, or from Central Asia to the edges of Eastern Europe, could do so with a reasonable expectation of reaching their destination alive and with their goods intact. A simple assurance that had seemed impossible just years before. This was revolutionary, truly revolutionary in its implications. It changed the very nature of world commerce, transformed the economics of long-distance trade. Goods that had been luxury items, traded in tiny quantities at extraordinary prices because of the risk and expense involved in getting them to market, became more readily available, more accessible to people of moderate means rather than just the wealthy elite. The flow of goods was matched by a flow of ideas, of technologies, of cultural practices, of knowledge that could now move across the world with an ease that had previously been impossible. The technologies of warfare that the Mongols had learned from the Chinese began to spread westward, carrying with them the innovations of the East to European craftsmen and engineers. Printing techniques, mathematical concepts, architectural innovations, all of these travelled along the roads that the Mongol Empire had made safe, seeding knowledge throughout the world. It is not too much to say that the Mongol conquests, for all their terrible violence, for all the destruction and suffering they entailed, created the conditions for a kind of global interconnectedness that would ultimately lead to the modern world. And yet this transformation was managed through one simple but extraordinarily effective document, a code that seems almost minimal in its expression but vast in its implications. It was called the Yasa, the law code of Genghis Khan, the fundamental legal framework upon which Mongol rule was constructed. Listen to the rhythm of that word. Yasa. It sounds almost like a lullaby, doesn't it? The sound of something ancient and powerful, something that has been given authority through the passage of time. And indeed, the Yasa represented something genuinely revolutionary, something that seemed to contradict the brutal methods by which Mongol power had been established. It was a unified legal code that applied across the entire Mongol Empire, regardless of the local customs, religions, or traditions of conquered peoples, creating a kind of uniform field of law within which everyone had to operate. It established a framework within which order could be maintained, predictability could be assured, justice could be administered according to known principles. The Yasa was not written down in a single document as far as we know. Rather, it existed as an oral tradition, interpreted and applied by officials throughout the empire, passed down through memory and practice rather than written text, but its principles were clear and consistent across the vast territories under Mongol control. They included the concept of religious tolerance, a remarkable feature given the era, given the centuries of religious conflict that had characterized medieval history. The Yasa protected places of worship of all faiths, whether Buddhist temples or Christian churches or Muslim mosques, recognizing that forcing religious conformity would be counterproductive. Mongol rulers might themselves be Buddhist or Christian or Muslim or shamanist, following the spiritual traditions they had inherited or adopted, but they did not impose their own faith on conquered populations. This was pragmatic, certainly, motivated by the understanding that religious diversity could be accommodated if properly managed, but it was also revolutionary in its recognition that different peoples could coexist under a single rule while maintaining distinct spiritual traditions. The Yasa also established a system of meritocracy, a principle that seemed almost radical in its implications. In the Mongol Empire, it was possible for men of talent, regardless of their birth or ethnic origin, regardless of whether they came from noble families or humble circumstances, to rise to positions of authority and power. The empire was hungry for capable administrators, for talented generals, for clever strategists who could help manage the vast territories that were under Mongol control. If you had those abilities and if you proved your loyalty to the Khan, advancement was possible, was even probable if your talents were great enough. This stood in sharp contrast to the feudal systems of Europe or the rigidly hierarchical structures of China, where birth and family connections often determined your entire life's trajectory, where the accident of being born in the wrong family could condemn you to poverty regardless of your abilities. The Yasa also established the principle of diplomatic immunity, a concept that seems almost obvious to the modern mind but was genuinely innovative in the 13th century. Envoys moving between states, carrying messages and conducting negotiations, were protected, were granted safe passage even through territories at war with each other. This was an extraordinary innovation, essentially creating a framework for international relations that could continue even during times of conflict, that could survive the outbreak of violence. Wars could be conducted without destroying the ability of different powers to communicate with each other, without eliminating the possibility of negotiation and settlement. This principle, established by Genghis Khan in the 13th century, would eventually become a cornerstone of modern international law, a foundation upon which the entire framework of diplomatic relations still rests. Imagine the world as it existed before these codes were established, a world of chaos and unpredictability where conquered peoples lived in fear, unsure of what laws applied to them, unsure what they could expect from their new rulers, waiting always for the next outbreak of violence. But the Yasa, for all its severity, for all the ways it could be enforced through violence and terror when people chose to violate its provisions, brought a kind of clarity, a kind of order that was almost comforting in its consistency. You knew where you stood, you knew what the rules were, and if you followed them, you could survive, you could even prosper, you could build things, accumulate wealth, establish families, and create lives that had meaning and purpose within the framework of Mongol rule. But now, as we trace the arc of this empire, we come to a moment that must have seemed unthinkable to those who had followed Genghis Khan with absolute loyalty, who had built their entire lives around his leadership. The great conqueror himself was aging, growing older with each passing year, his body accumulating the weight and weariness that time brings to all living things. A man who had built an empire through sheer force of will and military brilliance could not, it seemed, conquer death itself, could not indefinitely postpone the final reckoning that comes for all mortals regardless of their achievements. Various accounts describe his final illness. Some speak of an accident while hunting that opened a wound that would not heal, others of disease that consumed him from within. The exact nature of his death remains obscure, veiled in the mists of time, something that historians have speculated about for centuries without reaching consensus. In 1227, on the steppes that had birthed him, Genghis Khan died. He was perhaps in his 60s, an age that in those days was considered very great indeed, an achievement given the hardships of nomadic life and the constant risk of violence. And with his death came something that seems, in retrospect, almost inevitable, and yet was at the time profoundly troubling to those who depended on the unity that Genghis Khan had maintained through sheer force of personality. The Great Khan left no single undisputed heir, no obvious successor who could claim the absolute authority that Genghis Khan had wielded. He had many sons, and the question of succession divided the empire as it had never been divided before, threatening to fragment it into separate pieces that would war against each other. The principle established was that his sons would divide the empire among them, with the oldest, Yochi, receiving the western territories, and the youngest, Tolui, receiving the homeland steppes that had birthed the Mongol nation, while the middle sons, Chagatai and Ogedei, received the middle territories that connected east and west. It was Ogedei, the youngest of the sons who would inherit the Great Khanate itself, who would ultimately be chosen to lead the entire empire, to hold the position of supreme authority. This was decided through a Kurultai, a gathering of the Mongol nobility where the traditions of steppe democracy were observed, and it represented a kind of democratic process within the Mongol system, though one that was ultimately subject to the will of the strongest, to the political manoeuvring of ambitious princes and their supporters. The mystery of Genghis Khan's grave has haunted historians and treasure hunters ever since that day when he was laid to rest, has inspired countless expeditions and speculations. His body, according to some accounts, was buried in secret, somewhere on the steppes where no one would ever find it, hidden in a location known only to a select few. The location was kept so carefully guarded that to this day, no one has discovered where he was laid to rest. No archaeologist has uncovered the resting place of the world's greatest conqueror. Some say this was intentional, that Genghis Khan himself had ordered it, wanting to ensure that his grave would never be desecrated, never become a shrine where enemies might gather, or where his remains might be disturbed. Others suggest that the secret died with those who knew it, that the knowledge was lost in the succession disputes and conflicts that followed his death. The grass has grown over whatever location once held his remains, the steppes transforming the ground so thoroughly that any markers or monuments have vanished beneath decades of growth. The steppes that he had conquered now hide his body beneath them, keeping his final resting place secret as if nature itself has conspired to preserve his mystery. There is something almost poetic about that, isn't there? The man who had conquered empires, who had brought half the known world under his control, who had demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost godlike to observers, now lies unknown and undiscovered in the very land that had created him. His grave one more mystery among the many that surround his extraordinary life. But even as his body dissolved back into the earth, even as time began its slow work of transforming flesh into soil, the empire he had created pressed forward with an almost inexorable force, driven onward by the momentum he had given it. Ogedei Khan, his successor, continued the conquest with determination and strategic vision. Where Genghis Khan had focused on Central Asia and Persia, where he had spent his energy on the conquest of the Islamic world, Ogedei turned his attention northward and westward toward new horizons. The armies of the Mongol Empire began to move into Eastern Europe, crossing into territories that had never seen Mongol warriors before. This was not a peripheral campaign, not a minor military operation designed to secure a border. This was a direct assault on the very regions that would soon be called Russia, on the kingdoms and principalities that existed there in a patchwork of competing powers and uncertain allegiances. The people of Russia had no real understanding of what was about to hit them, no framework of knowledge within which they could comprehend the scale and nature of the force approaching them. In 1237, the Mongols began the conquest of Russia, one of the most systematic and devastating campaigns in medieval history. The campaign lasted for years, moving methodically from north to south, destroying city after city, leaving behind a landscape of ruins and abandoned settlements. In 1241, some of these armies wheeled westward, turning toward Europe proper in a movement that suggested further conquest might be possible. They moved into the Kingdom of Hungary, and the response of the European kingdoms was inadequate, almost laughably so given what was approaching. The Hungarian army was decisively defeated at the Battle of Moe in 1241, an engagement that would be remembered as one of the great catastrophes of medieval European history. This was not a close-run thing, not a battle where victory hung in the balance and fortune could have swung either way. The Mongols utterly shattered the Hungarian resistance, demonstrating their military superiority in every dimension. Contemporary accounts describe the Mongol tactics with something approaching awe: the feigned retreat, the sudden wheeling movement, the circling maneuver, the devastating assault on the flanks that caught the European cavalry in a tactical trap. The Hungarian cavalry, which had always been proud and effective in European conflicts, which had won numerous victories against neighbouring powers, was no match for the Mongol warriors on their horses, for fighters who had spent their entire lives on horseback and treated horsemanship as an art form. Thousands of Hungarians were killed. The kingdom was devastated, its military power effectively broken in a single afternoon of fighting. After Mohi, the Mongol armies could have continued their relentless advance into the heart of Europe, and the more cautious European rulers lay awake at night contemplating that possibility. Europe lay vulnerable to what seemed like inevitable conquest, its defences fragmented among competing kingdoms and principalities. The roads were open, the mountain passes could be crossed, nothing stood between the Mongol armies and the wealthy kingdoms of Western Europe. They wheeled toward Austria, and the gates of Vienna itself came into sight, within reach of conquerors who had brought empires to their knees. In the histories written afterward, this is often described as the moment when Europe trembled, when Western Christendom faced the prospect of being overrun by these heathen invaders from the east, when the very survival of Christian civilization hung in the balance. But what happened next is one of the great mysteries of history, a puzzle that historians have debated for nearly 8 centuries. The Mongols did not assault Vienna. They did not, in fact, continue deeper into Europe. Instead, they turned back, withdrawing as mysteriously as they had advanced. Historians debate the reasons with passionate intensity. Some suggest that Ögedei Khan's death in 1241 led to a recall of the armies so that the succession could be managed at the centre of power so that the Khans could gather and determine the shape of the empire going forward. Others propose that the logistics of maintaining such a massive force so far from their supply lines was becoming untenable, that the lines of communication had stretched too thin, that the supplies could no longer be reliably delivered. Still others suggest that the Mongols simply decided that the costs of further conquest in Europe were too high relative to the gains to be made, that they made a rational calculation and determined that Europe was simply not worth the effort required to conquer it. Whatever the reason, whatever combination of factors led to the decision, the great Mongol advance into Europe halted as suddenly as it had begun. The gates of Vienna were never breached. Europe's future would be decided by European powers, not Mongol Khans, by the complex political interactions of Christian kingdoms, rather than by the will of the great Khan. But the mark of that encounter, that moment when Mongol and European powers faced each other across the divide of thousands of miles and centuries of cultural separation, would haunt European consciousness for generations to come. The Mongols were the living proof that the world extended far beyond the boundaries of Christendom, that there existed powers and armies and capabilities that challenged everything European rulers thought they knew about warfare and empire. The impact of that revelation, even in the absence of conquest, was profound. It sparked a kind of intellectual awakening, a recognition that the familiar European world was only one part of a much larger and more complex whole. And so here, in this moment of conclusion and beginning, in this place where history transitions into the dream that carries you towards sleep, we pause to let your consciousness drift backward through these centuries, travelling in the opposite direction from the Mongol armies as they advanced. The silence of the conquered cities returns to you, the silence of abandonment and loss. The drumming of the horses' hooves across endless steppes echoes in your awareness. The wind through mountain passes carries sounds from the distant past. The crackling of libraries as they burn creates a sound that resonates across time. The code of the Yasa spoken in 1,000 different tongues, a single law expressed through the voice of countless administrators and officials, the mystery of a grave hidden somewhere beneath the earth, keeping secrets that the world will never know. These images and sounds swirl together in your mind as the great empire begins to fragment into 4 separate khanates, each pursuing its own path, each leaving its mark on the world in its own unique way. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, each became a centre of power, each developed its own character and trajectory. Feel the weight of these centuries passing, the accumulated mass of time and change. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, for all the suffering it inflicted and the destruction it wrought, had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human history. It had connected continents that had been separate, had brought peoples into contact who had barely known of each other's existence. It had demonstrated capabilities that had seemed impossible, had extended the reach of human power and organisation to a scale that would not be matched for centuries. It had created systems of governance that would outlast the empire itself, that would influence how rulers thought about law and administration long after the Mongol political structure had fragmented. And as we drift deeper into sleep, as your consciousness begins to blur the lines between the past and the present, between history and dream, between what was and what is, know that the echoes of these events continue to shape the world as it exists today. The cities that were destroyed have been rebuilt, often in the same locations, often incorporating stone from the ruins of their predecessors. The trade routes that the Mongols made safe have evolved into the infrastructure of modern commerce. The paths of global exchange that connect markets across continents. The legal principles that Genghis Khan established have become foundational to the international order, have shaped how nations interact with each other and how law is conceived. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, somewhere on the vast Mongolian steppes, the body of the great conqueror continues its rest, keeping its secrets, remaining forever hidden from the eyes of those who would seek it. Let this knowledge drift through your mind like clouds across a vast sky, shifting and changing, never quite solid, never quite fixed. And as it does, feel yourself becoming lighter, heavier, sinking deeper into a place of true peace, a space where history becomes memory, becomes dream, becomes the peaceful darkness of sleep itself. Picture, if you will, a man standing alone in a tent woven from the finest silk, watching the last light of evening drain from the sky. His name is Kublai Khan, and he is perhaps the most powerful human being alive. The year is 1260, and he's about to become something far greater than even his legendary grandfather Genghis ever imagined. Not merely a conqueror of lands, but a builder of worlds, a creator of dynasties that would reshape civilization itself. Kublai is not like other Khans. Where his grandfather was a man of the saddle and the sword, Kublai is a man of philosophy and vision. He has studied the ancient ways of China, absorbed its wisdom, contemplated its mysteries as deeply as any scholar who ever lived. His eyes are sharp and intelligent, and his mind moves like water, flowing around obstacles rather than crashing through them. He understands something that many of his kinsmen do not, that an empire built only on conquest will eventually collapse under its own weight, that true power comes not from the fear you inspire, but from the respect you command and the beauty you create. It is in this moment, standing in his tent as darkness falls, that Kublai Khan makes a decision that will echo through centuries. He will not simply rule the lands his family has conquered, he will transform them. He will become a Chinese emperor, embracing the very civilization he was born to destroy, and he will build a capital so magnificent, so breathtaking in its vision and execution, that travellers from across the known world will speak of it in hushed, reverent tones for centuries to come. That capital bears two names, depending on who speaks it. To the Mongols, it is Khanbalik, the Khan's city, the seat of absolute power. To the Chinese, it is called Beijing, the northern capital, a name that carries the weight of ancient dynasties and the promise of new ones. But before that great city rises from the plains, Kublai first conceives of another place, a retreat from the burdens of empire, a sanctuary where the mind can wander as freely as the wind across the steppes. The pleasure palace of Xanadu. Imagine walking through gardens where the air itself seems to shimmer with perfume. Crystal fountains sing as water cascades over jade and marble. Pavilions of silver and gold catch the sun and scatter it like diamonds across the earth below. Exotic animals roam through carefully manicured parks. Tigers from Bengal, elephants from Siam, birds of paradise whose feathers seem to contain all the colours that exist in the visible world. The forests around Xanadu are stocked with deer and antelope, their coats glossy and perfect, their movements effortless and graceful. Everything here exists in perfect harmony, a reflection of the cosmic order, a physical manifestation of heaven itself brought down to earth. The walls of the palace are constructed from the rarest materials, jade that took entire teams of workers years to find and shape. Marble imported from distant provinces, each block cut with such precision that they fit together without mortar, held in place by the perfection of their geometry alone. The roofs are tiled with glazed ceramics in brilliant colours, sapphire blue, emerald green, the deep red of dawn breaking over mountains. When the light hits them just right, the entire palace seems to glow with an inner fire. Inside, the corridors stretch on and on, each one leading to new wonders. Walls are painted with scenes of paradise, mountains shrouded in mist, rivers flowing through valleys of impossible beauty, celestial beings floating on clouds. The finest artists and craftsmen in all of Asia have been brought here to create these visions, and their work is so perfect, so flawlessly executed, that looking at a painted river, you can almost hear the sound of water moving across stone. The royal chambers are beyond description, furniture carved from single pieces of sandalwood, the grain of the wood visible like the flowing of rivers, silk hangings so delicate and finely woven that they seem to be made not from thread but from solidified air itself, carpets so thick and soft that your feet sink into them as though you were walking across clouds. The beds are canopied with curtains of the finest imperial yellow, a colour reserved only for the emperor himself, a colour so sacred that commoners who gazed upon it without permission could face death. Kublai Khan created Xanadu as a physical expression of his own vision of paradise, but it was also something more. It was proof that the Mongols, conquerors of the world, could also be creators, that they could build something beautiful and lasting, that they could establish a culture, not merely destroy one. And the empire watched as their Khan poured resources beyond counting into this retreat, and they understood that something had fundamentally shifted in the nature of their civilization. But Xanadu was merely the jewel in a greater crown. The true seat of power was always going to be Kanbalik, the capital of capitals, the city that would become the administrative centre of the entire Yuan dynasty. Picture the construction. Tens of thousands of workers moving across the plains like ants, each one carrying their small part of the vision forward. The engineers sketch out plans with mathematical precision. Massive walls will surround the city, walls so thick that 10 men could ride their horses abreast along the top. The walls themselves are built from brick and stone, layer upon layer, forming a barrier between the civilized world within and the chaos without. The streets inside are laid out in a perfect grid, a pattern of absolute order. Avenues run north and south, cross streets run east and west, and at the intersections are markets and gathering places. The palace stands at the very centre of the city on the highest ground, so that if you were to stand in the marketplace at the city's heart and look in any direction, your eye would eventually find the palace, the seat of power, the axis around which all other things revolve. Kanbalik rises not in a single season or even a single year. It takes decades of labour, the commitment of resources so vast that it staggers the imagination. But when it is finally complete, when the last tile is placed on the last roof, when the last street is paved with its proper stone, Kanbalik becomes the largest city in the world, a city of perhaps 1 million souls, greater in population than any European city, greater in complexity and organisation, greater in its expression of power and control. The Khan's palace itself sits within its own walls, separated from the general city, a sacred space where the emperor communes with heaven itself. The audience hall is constructed from vast beams of wood so massive that they had to be transported across hundreds of miles, each one carried by teams of oxen. The ceiling soars so high overhead that voices echo like music in an underground cavern. Gold leaf covers nearly every surface, and when servants light the lanterns at dusk, the light reflects and multiplies, creating the impression that you have stepped not into a building made by human hands, but into the dwelling place of the gods themselves. It is into this world of splendour and impossible grandeur that a merchant from Venice arrives one day, his clothes dust-stained from the road, his eyes wide with wonder at what he sees around him. His name is Marco Polo, and he is about to become the most famous traveller in history, the man whose journey across the Silk Road would inspire fascination and longing for centuries to come. Picture Marco Polo arriving in Kanbalik for the first time. He has travelled for years to reach this place. The Silk Road stretches behind him like a thread connecting worlds, passing through deserts where the heat is so intense that if you were to stop for too long, the sand itself would creep into your eyes and steal your sight. Mountains so high that the air grows thin and cold, where the wind carries sounds across miles as if space itself had no meaning. Through valleys where the rivers run white with fury, where bridges made from rope and wood swing over abysses that seem to descend into the very depths of the earth. And now, after all that hardship, Marco Polo sees Kanbalik, and his merchant's mind, trained to value and assess and judge, simply breaks. He He cannot articulate the wonder. His words, when he finally manages to write them down years later, struggle to capture what he witnessed. He describes streets lined with shopkeepers selling goods from every corner of the known world. Spices from the Moluccas that smell of exotic sunsets. Silks from regions he has never heard of, each one a different colour, a different texture. Gemstones of every variety, arranged on merchant stalls like stars fallen to earth. The smell of incense burning in temples dedicated to religions he doesn't quite understand. The sound of languages he has never heard before, spoken by traders from lands so distant that geography itself seems almost magical. He describes the Khan himself, how even from a great distance away, even surrounded by thousands of courtiers and attendants, the Khan's presence is so powerful that you feel it like heat radiating from a great fire. How the Khan's eyes, when they look upon you, see not just your surface but your soul, your intentions, your very essence. How when the Khan speaks, every voice in the hall falls silent, and even the air itself seems to hold its breath to listen. And what happens next would change the world forever. Because Marco Polo, this merchant from a small Italian city, falls in love with this empire. Not with romantic love, but with something deeper. He falls in love with the idea that civilization could be so vast, so organized, so beautiful, so utterly convinced of its own permanence and rightness. He spends 17 years in service to Kublai Khan, travelling throughout the empire, conducting business, gathering knowledge, and when he finally returns to Venice, he brings with him stories so grand, so magnificent, that people initially believe him to be a liar. How could one man have seen such wonders? How could such a place really exist? Yet Marco Polo's accounts contain a truth that transcends the specific facts of his travels. He understood something essential, that the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan represented something entirely new in human civilization, a multicultural state that welcomed merchants and ideas and different religions and ways of thinking. It was, in its own way, a preview of a modern world that would not truly come into being for centuries. But empires, no matter how great, no matter how carefully constructed, no matter how perfect they appear, carry within themselves the seeds of their own decline. And for Kublai Khan, the first hint of that decline comes from an unexpected direction, from the sea. In 1274, Kublai Khan orders an invasion of Japan. To his mind, it is a simple matter. Japan is an island nation, relatively close to the Asian mainland. His navy has grown powerful. His armies are still feared and respected throughout the world. Surely the conquest of this island kingdom is merely a matter of logistics and proper organization. The Khan assembles a fleet of ships and transport vessels unlike anything that has been seen before. Estimates suggest as many as 900 or even 1,500 vessels, carrying perhaps 20,000 soldiers. The armada sails out toward Japan with the confidence of an empire that has never known defeat. The Japanese, however, do not wait passively for the invasion to reach their shores. They prepare defences, build walls, organise their forces, and then, as the Mongol fleet approaches, something happens that seems almost supernatural. A storm rises from the sea, waves so massive that they swallow entire ships, wind so violent that it tears vessels apart like they were made of paper. The Mongol fleet is scattered, broken, destroyed. Those soldiers who do manage to land are met by fierce Japanese resistance, and the invasion fails. Kublai Khan is shocked, incredulous. An empire that has conquered vast continents cannot be defeated by weather. But the very next year, he orders another invasion. Surely this was simply bad luck, a failure of preparation. This time the fleet will be larger, better equipped, better organized. Again the ships are assembled, again the soldiers embark, and again they sail toward Japan with the absolute certainty that conquest awaits. And then, once more, the heavens open. A storm even more terrible than the first rises up to meet the invaders. Typhoons of such power that they seem to be expressions of the will of the gods themselves. The Japanese people, witnessing the destruction of two massive invasion fleets by storms that appeared at the moment of greatest peril, became convinced that they were protected by divine intervention. They called this protective force the kamikaze, the divine wind, the breath of the gods themselves turned against those who would invade the sacred islands of Japan. The Mongol Empire, for the first time in its existence, had encountered something it could not conquer. Not an army, not a fortification, not a kingdom or a state, but nature itself, seemingly arrayed against it. And this failure, though it might not have been apparent at the time, would become a symbol, a sign that even the greatest human power has limits, that even the mightiest emperor cannot command the wind and the rain, cannot override the fundamental forces of the universe itself. But in the moment, the effect was nonetheless profound. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Mongols, the sense that they were a force of nature themselves, unstoppable and inevitable, had been tarnished. Cracks had appeared in the facade, and as if mirroring the fracturing of that facade in external conquest, the empire itself began to fragment from within. By the time of Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the vast Mongol Empire that his grandfather Genghis had unified, through force of will and military genius, had transformed into something very different. It was no longer a single, cohesive state, under centralized control, but rather 4 great khanates, 4 separate kingdoms, each one ruled by a different branch of the Khan family, each one competing for power, for resources, for prestige, for the ultimate claim to be the true heir of Genghis Khan's legacy. The first of these was the Yuan dynasty, the one we have been discussing, established by Kublai in China. This was the heartland, the most developed, the most wealthy, the seat of the greatest power. But even as Kublai's descendants ruled from Khanbalik, 3 other kingdoms carved out their own territories, their own destinies, their own visions of what the Mongol legacy should be. To the west, in the steppes above the Black Sea, was the Golden Horde. This Khanate controlled the great trade routes that connected Asia to Europe, and through these routes flowed not just goods but ideas, technologies, diseases. The Golden Horde became the filter through which the Eastern world communicated with the Western, and in doing so they accumulated wealth so great that their capitals, cities like Sarai and Sarai Burq, rivaled Khanbalik in splendour and size. Farther west still, in the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian, the Ilkhanate held sway. This was the smallest of the 4 khanates in terms of territory, but it was perhaps the most cosmopolitan. The Ilkhans embraced Persian culture, Persian learning, Persian art. They built cities that became centres of scholarship and refinement. Here, mathematics and astronomy and medicine advanced at a pace that rivaled or exceeded contemporary developments in Europe. The Ilkhans commissioned works of art and literature that merged Mongol power with Persian sensibility, creating something entirely new, something that could never have existed without the conquest. And in the region of Central Asia between China and Persia was the Chagatai Khanate, a realm of steppes and mountains, of nomadic peoples and ancient cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. This Khanate was perhaps the most purely nomadic of all, the one that held most closely to the traditions of the steppe warriors from which all the Mongols had originally emerged. These 4 kingdoms existed in a complex web of relationships. Sometimes they were allies, sometimes they were enemies, sometimes they fought each other for control of borderlands and trade routes, sometimes they cooperated to maintain the facade of a unified empire. But the fundamental truth was that the Mongol Empire was no longer truly an empire at all. It was a family business, and like many family businesses, it was fracturing under the weight of competition and conflicting interests. And the answer to that question is far stranger than anyone imagined. The 4 khanates were not merely fragmented by political conflicts and territorial disputes. They were fragmented by something far more deadly, far more terrible, something that would kill millions and reshape the political and social landscape of the entire known world. They were fragmented by plague. The Black Death, as it came to be known in Europe, emerged from somewhere in Central Asia, possibly in the foothills where the boundaries between the Chagatai Khanate and the Yuan dynasty met. The exact origins are lost to history, shrouded in mystery and time, but the disease itself is almost certainly bubonic plague, a bacterial infection that can be carried by fleas living in the fur of rodents. For centuries this plague had existed in quiet equilibrium in certain regions of Asia, affecting local populations but remaining relatively contained. But then the Mongol trade routes became more established, more secure, more travelled. Merchants moved across the Silk Road with greater frequency. Caravans carried goods and materials that had been impossible to transport before, and along with the silks and spices and gemstones, they also carried rats whose fleas carried the plague bacteria. The disease spread gradually at first, moving along the trade routes, following the paths that merchants had established. It reached the Golden Horde, it reached the Ilkhanate, and then, travelling westward along the same routes that had carried Marco Polo's wonder to Venice, it reached Europe. When it arrived, it did so not with warning or fanfare, but silently, invisibly, carried perhaps in the cargo holds of ships travelling between the Black Sea and Mediterranean ports. The first cases appeared in southern Europe in the mid-14th century, and what followed was a catastrophe of such magnitude that it seemed to many people at the time that the very world was ending. Picture a medieval European city struck by plague. The streets fill with the dying and the dead. The smell of death, of decay, of human suffering becomes so overwhelming that people tie cloth soaked in herbs and spices over their faces, trying in vain to block out the stench. Entire families die within days of each other, sometimes within hours. Whole professions disappear, blacksmiths, tailors, priests, until there is simply no one left to practice them. The living dig mass graves, throwing corpses into them by the hundreds, by the thousands, until the graves become more like cesspools of death than burial sites. Estimates suggest that the Black Death killed perhaps 75 million people across Eurasia. Some historians argue for even higher numbers. In Europe alone, the population was reduced by perhaps 30 to 40%. In some regions, the death toll was even higher. The social fabric of medieval society, already strained by feudalism and constant warfare, was torn to pieces. And the connection to the Mongol Empire is direct. Without the trade routes that the Mongols had established and secured, without the relative peace and security of travel that Pax Mongolica had created, the plague would not have spread so rapidly, so widely, so devastatingly. In this sense, the greatest achievement of the Mongols, their ability to unify and secure vast territories, became, indirectly, the mechanism for one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. The irony is profound. The Mongols had created a world in which exchange was possible, in which goods and ideas could flow freely across continents, in which a Venetian merchant could travel to distant Cathay and return home with knowledge of wonders beyond imagining. But that same open world, that same freedom of movement, carried with it a danger that no one could have anticipated. The plague was the price, in a sense, of globalization. The Mongol Khanates watched their populations plummet. The wealth that had seemed so inexhaustible suddenly became exhausted. The armies that had seemed so invincible became weakened by disease, by mortality, by the simple fact that there were fewer and fewer people to draw upon for soldiers and workers. The illusion of permanence and invulnerability that had sustained the Mongol Empire for a century began to crack and crumble. And perhaps around this moment, sitting in your own space, listening to these words, you might reflect on the ways that power, no matter how great, is always fragile. If you are finding this journey through the Mongol Empire as fascinating as we hope, consider subscribing to the Calm Archive, where every night brings a new chapter of history to carry you gently into sleep. How empires that seem destined to last forever can be toppled not by armies or rivals, but by forces invisible to the eye, by the simple circulation of goods, by the unintended consequences of human action. It is a meditation on impermanence itself, a reminder that nothing endures unchanged forever, that all things rise and all things fall, that the greatest cities eventually turn to dust. Here now, as the 14th century wears on, the Yuan dynasty in China faces challenges on all sides. The plague has weakened it. The military tradition of the Mongols is fading as the second and third generations of Mongol rulers in China become more Chinese themselves, more immersed in luxury and court politics, less concerned with the arts of horseback combat and conquest. The Chinese population has never fully accepted Mongol rule, and as the dynasty shows signs of weakness, more and more resistance movements emerge. Rebellions spring up across the Chinese territories. Some are religious in nature, others are purely political. Groups of bandits and insurgents organize into larger forces, sometimes coordinated, sometimes acting independently, but all united by a desire to see the Mongol Yuan dynasty fall and a Chinese dynasty, specifically the Ming dynasty, rise in its place. By 1368, less than 75 years after Kublai Khan's death, the Yuan dynasty has collapsed. The Ming forces have driven the Mongols out of China, reclaimed the capital that is now called Beijing rather than Kanbalik, and established their own dynasty that will rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Mongols themselves flee northward, back to Mongolia, back to the steppes where their power had first originated. In a kind of historical poetry, the cycle completes itself. The empire that had begun as nomadic tribes conquering settled civilization has, at the end of its reign in China, been conquered by a settled civilization and forced back into the wilderness from which it came. But the story of Mongol power does not end with the fall of the Yuan dynasty. Far to the west, in the steppes and deserts of Central Asia, a new figure is rising to power, a figure who will be remembered as one of the most terrible military commanders in history, a man so ruthless and so brilliant that he will make even Genghis Khan seem merciful by comparison. His name is Timur, though history will know him better by the name Tamerlane, the Lame, so called because a war wound rendered him unable to walk without difficulty. Yet somehow this injury only seemed to intensify his will, his determination, his hunger for conquest. Timur is not a pure-blooded Mongol, but he claims descent from Genghis Khan through his mother's line, and he models himself entirely upon the image of the great conqueror. Where Timur differs from Genghis Khan is in his approach to conquest. Genghis Khan was ruthless, yes, but he also recognized the value of incorporating conquered peoples into his empire, of allowing them to retain their cultural identities as long as they submitted to Mongol rule and paid tribute. Timur, by contrast, seems motivated purely by the desire to demonstrate his power, to leave behind him a trail of destruction so complete that it serves as a warning to all who might think to resist him. Imagine the cities that fell before Timur's armies. In some cases, the armies would arrive and the city would surrender without resistance, hoping for mercy. Timur would order its complete destruction anyway. Buildings would be torn down, stone by stone. The population would be put to the sword or enslaved or dispersed. The rubble itself would be scattered so thoroughly that travellers coming through months later would struggle to even identify where a city had once stood. In other cases, cities would resist, and the consequences would be even more terrible. Timur would order his soldiers to build towers out of the skulls of the dead, monuments to his power made from human bone. He would order the surviving inhabitants to be stacked in piles while still alive and then buried under layers of earth and stone, creating a living grave. He would pour molten lead into the eyes of those he wished to spare, but wanted to ensure could never serve as soldiers for his enemies again. All of this was calculated, deliberate, designed to create an atmosphere of such terror that the mere approach of Timur's armies would cause populations to flee in panic, sometimes abandoning their cities entirely rather than face conquest. In this sense, Timur achieved through fear what required armies for other commanders, and yet, for all his brutality, Timur was not mindless in his conquest. Like Kublai Khan, he understood the value of creating something beautiful, of establishing a legacy that went beyond destruction. He founded a capital city of his own, Samarkand, and he filled it with the spoils of his conquests. Craftsmen kidnapped from conquered cities, artisans and builders and scholars brought there by force but given the resources to create works of extraordinary beauty. Samarkand became paradoxically one of the great intellectual and cultural centres of its time, a city of magnificent mosques and madrasas and libraries, built quite literally on foundations of human suffering and death. Timur's conquests extended from China in the east to Anatolia in the west, from the Black Sea to the Indian Ocean. He conquered regions that had been part of the original Mongol Empire, bringing them back under the sway of a man who claimed to be the true heir to Genghis Khan. And for a brief moment it seemed as though the Mongol Empire might rise again, unified under a single powerful ruler, terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. But Timur's power, like that of Genghis Khan himself, could not be sustained after his death. His empire fragmented among his many sons and grandsons, and within a few generations it had dissolved entirely. The great khanates that had emerged from Genghis Khan's legacy all fell in their own times, conquered by rising powers, consumed by internal strife, weakened by the forces of history and change. By the 15th century, the age of Mongol dominance was truly over. The Mongol people still existed, of course. They returned to Mongolia, to their ancestral homelands, and they maintained their identities as a distinct people. But they no longer ruled a world empire. The stage of history had moved on to other actors. Europeans were beginning to explore and colonize. The Ottoman Empire was rising in the east. New powers were emerging from the ashes of the old. And yet the legacy of the Mongol Empire, the legacy of Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and Timur, lived on in the world they had created and shaped. The Silk Road trade routes they had established would continue to function for centuries. The cultural exchanges they had enabled would continue to influence civilizations. The very idea that a single ruler could unite vast territories under a single administration, that a nomadic people could conquer and rule settled civilizations, that an empire could encompass multiple religions and cultures within a single political structure, these ideas had been proven possible by the Mongols, and they would inspire future rulers and empires for centuries to come. The capitals that Kublai Khan built, Xanadu and Khanbalik, fell into ruin after the Ming dynasty took over, but their memory persisted. Later explorers and writers would describe them in terms that seemed almost mythical. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, centuries later, would write a poem about Xanadu, imagining its pleasure domes and sunless seas, and he would capture something true about the historical reality, even as he transformed it into pure poetry. The idea of Kublai Khan's magnificent city had become more real, in some sense, than the actual ruins that remained. And so we come to the end of this chapter in the great story of human civilization. The Mongol Empire has fallen away like autumn leaves. The greatest cities have crumbled or been transformed. The Khans have passed into history, but the world they touched was forever changed. The connections they made, the routes they opened, the possibilities they demonstrated, these remain. And in the quietness of the night, as your eyelids grow heavy and the boundary between waking and sleeping begins to blur, you might imagine what it would have been like to stand in the court of Kublai Khan, to see the magnificence of Khanbalik at its height, to understand for just a moment what it felt like to live in a world where empires rose and fell with the turning of seasons, where one man's vision could reshape continents, where the greatest power on earth could be toppled not by weapons but by the invisible multiplication of a single microorganism, by the quiet turning of history's great wheel, by the inexorable march of time itself that cares nothing for human ambition, human dreams, human empires. As we descend deeper into the final meditation of our Mongol Empire journey, let yourself sink further into comfort, into the place where consciousness begins to drift like smoke across an endless horizon. The empire we have explored across these hours, this vast constellation of conquest and connection, now becomes not a story of dominion, but a testament to the invisible threads that bind our modern world to the choices made centuries ago on the high steppes. What Genghis Khan and his descendants created was not merely an empire of military might, but a transformation of how the world itself could move, how ideas could travel, how East and West could finally know each other through something deeper than fear. The legacy of the Mongol Empire threads through every aspect of our contemporary existence in ways so subtle that we have forgotten to notice them. When you open a book with pages of pressed fibre, when you navigate using instruments that measure degrees and direction, when you taste a spice that travelled trade routes established under Mongol protection, you are touching the fingerprints of history that Genghis Khan left upon the earth. The Mongols did not merely conquer territories, they created corridors. They established the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace that allowed merchants and monks, scholars and soldiers to move across continents with a freedom that would not return to the world for centuries. Imagine the weight of that legacy settling upon your shoulders now, not as burden but as comfort, the knowledge that your very ability to communicate across distances, to access knowledge from distant lands flows directly from decisions made in the 13th century. The gunpowder that changed warfare, the printing technologies that revolutionized communication, the mathematical systems that enabled navigation, all of these moved along Mongol roads like water finding its path through stone. When you look at a map of the modern world, when you see nations and borders and trade routes, you're looking at the skeleton of something that was first shaped by the hooves of Mongol horses and the will of a people who understood that holding territory meant understanding it, that power meant not just dominion but comprehension. The Mongols created bureaucracies that borrowed from every civilization they conquered. They established postal systems that carried information across 3 continents. They protected merchants and pilgrims alike because they understood that an empire grows not through conquest alone, but through the circulation of goods, ideas, and the stories that transform how people think about the world. This knowledge, this understanding that your modern life is built upon foundations laid by a people often dismissed as mere barbarians, can settle into your mind now like sediment in still water, becoming part of the foundation upon which your peaceful thoughts rest. Yet even as the Mongol Empire shaped the world in ways both visible and invisible, there remains one mystery that has captivated explorers, historians and dreamers for nearly 800 years. the location of Genghis Khan's tomb. Deep in your mind, as your breathing becomes slower and more rhythmic, allow yourself to imagine the search for this legendary resting place, a quest that has taken on almost mythological proportions, becoming a puzzle wrapped in speculation and protected by the very nature of the landscape itself. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his followers honoured his wishes by burying him in secret, in a location so carefully concealed that despite centuries of searching, no confirmed tomb has ever been discovered. Some scholars believe it lies somewhere on the broad steppes of Mongolia, perhaps beneath the flowing grasses where wild horses still roam, perhaps hidden so completely that nature itself has made it invisible. In the 20th and 21st centuries, as technology advanced, expeditions began using methods that earlier seekers could never have imagined: satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, magnetic resonance surveys, all scanning the sacred landscape of Mongolia in search of that one undisturbed burial site. Picture these modern explorers moving across the ancient steppe with their instruments, as if trying to hear whispers from beneath the earth itself. Some expeditions have focused on the Khenti Mountains in northeastern Mongolia, a region of such natural beauty and spiritual significance that it was likely chosen as Genghis Khan's final resting place. A location so remote and protected by geography and by the fierce dedication of the people who live there that it has remained undiscovered. The very difficulty of the search has become part of the legend, as though the earth itself protects this secret, as though the mysteries of history are meant to remain partially hidden, reminding us that some things are not meant to be fully known. There are those who speak of a curse, stories passed down through generations of Mongols who say that anyone who disturbs the tomb will meet with calamity, that the spirits of the ancestors will not permit the desecration of Genghis Khan's burial place. Whether these tales are literal truth or metaphorical wisdom, they speak to something deeper, a recognition that some sacred places must remain untouched, that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, that there is wisdom in respecting boundaries that previous generations have drawn around sites of profound spiritual and historical significance. The Mongol people themselves have consistently opposed excavation attempts, not out of ignorance, but out of a deep understanding that their ancestors' wishes, expressed 8 centuries ago, deserve to be honoured. This protection of the unknown, this voluntary stepping back from the edge of certainty, has its own kind of peace, and you can breathe that peace into your own body now, releasing the need to know everything, to solve every puzzle, to illuminate every shadow. The mountain regions where these searches have taken place remain largely forbidden to foreign researchers, protected and preserved as sacred ground. The Khenti Mountains rise against the sky with an ancient dignity, their slopes covered in forests of larch and pine, their streams running clear and cold, their peaks catching the light of dawn and sunset in ways that have remained unchanged for millennia. Those rare researchers and adventurers who have been permitted to venture into these regions speak of a landscape that feels almost alive with presence, a place where the past seems not distant but immediate, where one can almost feel the hoofbeats of ancient riders echoing through the valleys. The earth itself seems to guard its secrets in these mountains, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the mystery of the tomb is more valuable than its discovery would be, a reminder that not everything that happened in human history needs to be fully excavated, fully analysed, fully understood. Some things, like sleep itself, are more powerful when they remain partially mysterious, when they draw us into deeper contemplation rather than final answers. Now, as your breathing continues to slow, as your mind drifts deeper into the space where waking and sleeping begin to blur, allow your awareness to expand outward from those forbidden mountains across the vast grasslands of Mongolia itself. These are the steppes, the endless rolling plains that have shaped the people who live there, that have defined Mongol identity for countless generations, that remain one of the last truly wild landscapes on our planet. The grasslands of Mongolia stretch across approximately 1.6 million square kilometres, a sea of green and gold grass that rolls toward horizons that seem impossibly distant, that seem to merge directly with the sky itself. Imagine standing in these grasslands now, not as a visitor from elsewhere, but as someone who belongs there, whose breathing matches the wind, whose heartbeat echoes the rhythm of the earth beneath your feet. In these grasslands, nomadic families still live much as their ancestors did, raising horses, yaks, sheep and goats, moving with the seasons, setting up their gyrs, traditional felt-covered circular dwellings, in locations chosen for water, grazing, and shelter from the wind. These families are the living continuation of the culture that Genghis Khan emerged from, the inheritors of knowledge about how to thrive in a landscape that demands resilience, flexibility, and a deep understanding of natural patterns. They know the grasslands not as a hostile environment to be conquered, but as a complex living system to which they belong, a relationship of mutual respect and cooperation that has sustained their way of life for centuries. When you imagine these families moving across the steppe, when you picture them reading weather patterns in the clouds, knowing where water will appear in the driest season, understanding which grasses indicate soil richness, you are touching a kind of wisdom that modern civilization has largely forgotten, a wisdom that comes from paying attention, from listening to what the land teaches. The jers themselves are marvels of efficient design, structures that can be assembled and disassembled within hours, that regulate temperature beautifully despite extreme seasonal variations, that provide warmth and shelter while remaining connected to the external environment through a central smoke hole. To live in a ger is to live partially inside and partially outside, to exist in a permeable boundary between domestic space and the wild landscape, a boundary that most modern dwellings have attempted to eliminate completely. Imagine now that you're moving across these grasslands toward an encampment as evening falls. The sun, which has been bright and intense all day, begins to descend toward the horizon, painting the grass in shades of amber and rose. In the distance, you can see the dark shape of a ger, smoke rising from its central opening, the smoke catching the evening light and turning to amber, then to rose, then to deeper red. As you draw closer, the smell of the grassland becomes stronger, the dry scent of earth and grass, the smell of wind that has travelled unobstructed for hundreds of kilometres, carrying with it the subtle fragrances of wild plants you cannot name. As you approach the encampment, you can hear sounds beginning to mark the shift from day to evening. The calls of distant birds heading towards sleep, the sound of horses moving across the grass, their hooves making soft impacts on the earth, the occasional neigh or whinny of communication between animals that have known each other for years. The family that tends this ger has invited you to share their evening, and you accept this gift with gratitude, understanding that in these remote grasslands, hospitality is not merely a courtesy, but a survival mechanism, a recognition that all travellers depend on the kindness of those who live in places far from towns and cities. As you duck through the entrance of the ger, bending low to pass through the doorway, you enter a space that seems impossibly warm and welcoming compared to the cooling evening outside. The contrast is startling. The transition from the expansive openness of the grasslands to the intimate interior of a dwelling designed for comfort and togetherness. The interior of the ger is arranged in a specific way, with the most honoured place directly opposite the entrance, the family fire in the centre, cooking implements and water containers positioned with careful intentionality. The walls are lined with felt, the same felt that covers the exterior, providing insulation so effective that you're suddenly struck by how warm this simple structure maintains itself. The family gestures for you to sit, offering you airag, fermented mare's milk, and dried meat, foods that sustain life in these grasslands where agriculture is impossible and pastoralism is the only viable way to live. You accept these gifts and settle into a place of honour, your body beginning to relax into the warmth of the ger, into the safety of being welcomed, into the rhythm of this household as it moves through the transition from day to night. The head of the family, a woman perhaps 50 years old with a weathered face that speaks of decades spent outdoors, tends to the fire. She moves with the economy of motion that comes from long experience, adding dried dung fuel to the flames with practiced precision, understanding exactly how much material will be needed to maintain the fire through the evening without creating excessive smoke. As she tends the fire, younger members of the family move around the ger's interior, completing small tasks, storing daytime items, preparing spaces for sleep, ensuring that everything needed for the night is within reach. The work seems choreographed despite appearing casual, a pattern repeated thousands of times, a knowledge embedded in muscle memory and passed from generation to generation through observation and participation rather than explicit instruction. As you sit warming yourself by the fire, sipping the airag and tasting the rich, slightly sour flavour of fermented milk, a taste that seems utterly foreign at first but begins to feel increasingly natural as you continue, the conversation flows in ways that are both deeply meaningful and entirely relaxed. The family tells you stories of the grasslands, of horses they have known, of winters so cold that the frozen earth becomes harder than stone, of springs so sudden that entire valleys transform within weeks from brown to brilliant green. These stories contain practical information woven seamlessly into narrative, teachings about how to read the land, how to predict weather, how to live well in a place that offers abundance to those who understand its patterns, but hardship to those who do not. The oldest member of the family, a grandfather whose face is more wrinkled than weathered, speaks rarely but with absolute authority, and when he speaks everyone listens, understanding that his words come from a depth of experience that is not available to younger people, no matter how intelligent or dedicated they might be. Night deepens outside the Jer. Through the central smoke hole you can see the sky transforming from deep blue to purple to the deepest navy, and then, gradually, at first subtly, then with increasing clarity, stars begin to emerge. More stars than you have ever seen before, far more than are visible from anywhere with electric light, more than most people in the modern world have ever witnessed. The stars appear not as individual points but as a vast luminous river, the Milky Way rendered visible in all its overwhelming complexity, a sight that has moved humans to awe and wonder since before written language existed. The family shows no particular surprise at the stars, having seen them every clear night of their lives, but they recognize the wonder in your expression and seem pleased by it, as if your amazement validates something they have always known, that there is true beauty in their landscape, that the poverty of visible stars in most of the modern world is a genuine loss, that what they have access to every evening is a gift that much of human civilization has forfeited. The family begins to prepare for sleep. Bedding is arranged around the perimeter of the Jer interior, felt mattresses placed on the ground, heavy blankets and quilts prepared for warmth through the night. The fire is banked carefully, the flames reduced to glowing embers that will continue to radiate heat without creating excessive smoke while people sleep. The family members lie down, and you are offered a place among them, a position that feels remarkably safe and comfortable, despite the simplicity of the bedding, despite the fact that you are indoors and outdoors simultaneously, separated from the vast grasslands only by felt walls. As you settle into the warmth of the bedding, as the members of the family arrange themselves for sleep around the dying fire, you become aware of the sounds that comprise the evening silence of the steppes. The wind moves continuously across the grasslands, and even within the Jer you can hear its soft voice, the rustle of wind moving through grass, the gentle movement of the felt walls in response to air currents that never entirely cease. This wind is not harsh or threatening, but rhythmic and lulling, a sound that has accompanied human sleep in these grasslands for millennia, a sound so constant that it becomes almost like silence itself, a kind of white noise that fades into the background of consciousness until you stop noticing it as external and begin to experience it as part of your own being. Layered beneath this wind sound is the occasional noise of the horses outside, a gentle neigh, the soft stamp of a hoof on earth, the movement of large animals through grass, sounds that indicate safety and presence, the knowledge that these noble creatures are nearby, watching in their own way, contributing to the security of the encampment. The fire continues its gentle work, the embers occasionally crackling as they shift and settle, the sound so faint and intermittent that it seems to belong more to memory than to present experience. Your breathing has begun to synchronize with the breathing of the sleeping family members, a collective respiration that seems almost like the breathing of the landscape itself, the inhale and exhale of wind and grass, the expansion and contraction of earth moving through night toward morning. As you rest here in the warmth of felt and fire, wrapped in blankets that smell of sheep's wool and wood smoke, your body begins to release the accumulated tension and worry that has been carried throughout the day, throughout life in the modern world. The weight of responsibilities fades, the urgency of tasks unsolved begins to dissolve, the concerns that seemed so pressing only hours ago become increasingly difficult to recall with any intensity of feeling. Your mind opens toward the vast sky visible through the Jer's smoke hole, toward the incredible universe of stars that blazes above the steppes, toward a sense of personal insignificance that is paradoxically reassuring rather than frightening. The recognition that you are a tiny being in an incomprehensibly large cosmos, and that this smallness is not a cause for despair, but for profound relief. The stars visible above Mongolia's grasslands include constellations that were known and named by ancient Mongol peoples, stars that guided travellers across the steppes, stars that were incorporated into mythology and storytelling for centuries before the modern astronomical naming conventions were developed in Europe. The Mongols read the heavens with the same attention to pattern and meaning that they read tracks on the ground, understanding that the sky was a map and a calendar and a source of cultural memory all simultaneously. The brightest stars held particular significance, and in Mongol tradition, certain constellations were associated with specific qualities and destinies. To lie on the grasslands and look up at these stars, to understand that the very stars above you were known and named by Genghis Khan's people, is to experience a continuity that stretches backward through centuries and forward into a future not yet written. The vast emptiness of the night sky above the steppes speaks to something deep within human consciousness, something that modern urban environments with their light pollution and constant artificial illumination have nearly extinguished. When you lie beneath stars this numerous, this bright, this overwhelming in their quantity and clarity, you begin to feel something shift in your consciousness, a sense of proportion, a recognition of the true scale of existence, a humbling awareness that despite all of human achievement and technological advancement, the universe remains largely incomprehensible, largely beyond our control, largely indifferent to human anxiety and effort. This is not a depressing recognition, but a liberating one. To acknowledge that you cannot control the stars, that the universe will continue its operations regardless of your worries, that problems that seemed insurmountable within the human sphere become almost invisible when contemplated against the backdrop of cosmic time and space. This is to access a form of peace that transcends mere relaxation, that approaches the edges of something like enlightenment. Your eyes grow heavy as you lie in the gyre, the warmth of the blankets and the fire's residual heat creating a cocoon of comfort around your body. The sounds of the grassland continue their gentle persistence. The wind, the distant horses, the faint crackling of fire, lulling your consciousness towards sleep with a consistency that cannot be resisted or questioned, that feels as natural and inevitable as the turning of the earth. You become aware that you are drifting, that the boundary between waking and sleeping is becoming permeable, that thoughts are beginning to take on the loose, associative quality of dreams even while you're still technically conscious. The family members around you sleep deeply, their breathing slow and regular, their bodies completely relaxed into the bedding and the warmth. You allow yourself to follow them into this rest, understanding that sleep is not an escape from life, but a return to something essential, a natural rhythm that human bodies require just as they require food and water and shelter. Your breathing slows further, becoming almost imperceptible, matching the breathing of the family and the grasslands themselves. The gyre seems to breathe with you, the felt walls moving infinitesimally with each shift of air pressure inside and outside the structure. The stars above continue their eternal journey through the sky, moving along paths established by gravity and the initial momentum given to the universe at its creation, paths that will continue unchanged long after you have woken, long after this particular night has become memory. The Mongol Empire that conquered the world is now history, its warriors long turned to dust, its empires transformed into the modern nation-states that map contemporary geography. Yet in some sense that empire continues even now, in the grasslands where nomadic families still live, in the genetic heritage of millions of people descended from Mongol rulers, in the trade routes and communication networks that echo the paths Mongol merchants travelled, in the knowledge systems and bureaucratic innovations that Mongol rulers implemented, and that continue to influence human organisation even now. In this moment, as you hover at the edge of sleep, as the gyre becomes a ship carrying you toward the shores of dreams, you're connected to all of this, to the vast grasslands that have existed since long before humans walked upon them, to the Mongol Empire that once controlled more territory than any other empire in human history, to the nomadic families who continue to live in these grasslands with a grace and sustainability that modern civilization has largely abandoned, to the stars that shine above with a constancy and indifference that is deeply reassuring. You are part of a continuity that stretches backward through centuries and forward into a future you will not live to see. And this awareness brings with it a peace that settles over your consciousness like snow falling in absolute silence, covering everything with white softness, erasing the distinctions between self and other, between present and past, between waking and sleeping. If you're enjoying this meditative journey through history and landscape, If you find yourself returning again and again to the Calm Archive for your sleep rituals, please know that you are joining a community of millions of people seeking peace, seeking rest, seeking connection to something larger than the daily anxieties of modern existence. Subscribe to the Calm Archive and let us continue to carry you toward sleep, toward dreams, toward the restoration that comes only in deep and undisturbed rest. The fire in the jar burns lower, the embers cooling slowly, the warmth persisting even as the visible flames disappear. Your thoughts become increasingly difficult to track, your consciousness beginning to fragment into the loose associations and strange logic of dreams. You're in the jar, but you're also riding across the grasslands on horseback, the wind moving through your hair, the stars wheeling above you in the night sky. You're walking through mountains searching for a hidden tomb, but the mountains are also becoming the folds of blankets around your body. You're listening to a Mongol warrior speak of distant lands and great conquests, but the voice is becoming the voice of wind, of fire, of your own breathing. The boundaries between these images, between past and present, between story and reality, dissolve completely. Sleep comes gently, without struggle, as natural as the setting of the sun or the rising of stars. Your body rests in the Jir on the grasslands of Mongolia, but your consciousness has travelled deeper, into territories that do not appear on any map, into regions where time moves differently, where the rules of waking logic no longer apply. You dream of endless grass, of clear sky, of fire and felt and the warmth of community. You dream of ancient empires and distant stars, of horses galloping across vast plains, of mysteries that remain beautifully and perfectly unsolved. You dream in the language of your deepest self, in images that speak to something ancient within your being, something that remembers open grasslands before cities were built, something that knows how to rest completely, something that trusts in the protection of night and the eventual return of dawn. Sleep deeply now. Rest completely. Let the grasslands hold you. Let the Jir shelter you. Let the stars watch over you. The Calm Archive wishes you the most peaceful of nights, the most restorative of sleep, the most beautiful of dreams. Sleep now and dream of the steppes. Sleep and be carried back to the place where human consciousness first learned to know peace.